So we're going to read part one of the story that I wrote for the church. It's called The Commander and the King, an Easter Story. If you want biblical context on the setting and the main character, then you can reference Acts chapter 21, 22, and 23. That's your clue. If you're wondering what's going on as we get started, and if you can't figure out what's going on for the first part of that, that's okay. I did that on purpose. So here we go. The Commander and the King. Tilt this just a little bit. This is part one, Chaos in the Courtyard. Actually, before we start, we'll just pray real quick. Father in heaven, thank you for Alethia. Thank you for the people here. Thank you for your church. Thank you for your scripture. Lord, we just put this in your hands and ask that our efforts to kind of be enlightened by your word and to get inside scripture, we just ask in Jesus' name that you'll meet us where we are, that you'll honor that, and that you'll do something good in our hearts with this story and with kind of revisiting your Easter story from different perspectives. So Father, we lift this to you and we lift the church to you, and we're so grateful for each person in the body, those who are here, those who aren't here. We just pray that you use this to edify your church. Amen. Everybody ready? All right, part one, Chaos in the Courtyard. I sighed and dropped the scroll. The little length of papyrus re-rolled itself and impudently settled against its brethren, the scraps of parchment and wax tablets also awaiting my attention on the left side of my table. I was trying to review the day's reports, but the distant noise was making it hard to concentrate. The tower fortress was rarely a quiet place in the middle of the afternoon, but I was used to, even most comfortable with, the organized sounds of the military proceedings, a background pulse of marching drills and command calls. However, the racket distracting me from my work didn't sound organized or military. I took a moment to listen to the clamor, distant but distinct. My centurions should be all over any issue with the soldiers. A game or a contest, maybe? No, the racket was too Jewish. Many voices shouting near the Jewish temple, presumably down by the colonnades connecting my fortress to their temple. Then, instantly recognizable, the thud of footsteps coming down the tower stairs from the watch posted higher up the tower. There was a reason I kept an office in the lower levels of the watchtower. I liked to be the first to know what was going on. The tower could see across the fortress into the temple courtyards, the city of Jerusalem, and even across the Kidron Valley. Knowing the approaching footsteps would be a messenger coming to see me, and certain I would not be returning to my day's reports anytime soon, I glanced consciously at the unfinished work on my desk and stood up. After hearing a brief, muffled exchange outside my door between my bodyguards and the messenger, one of my guards knocked sharply. I had already slipped my breastplate over my tunic and secured the straps at my sides. I could sense the urgency on the other side of my door. We would be moving quickly. I spoke loudly, "Come in." One of my guards opened the door. The breathless messenger stepped inside, extended his arm in crisp salute, and spoke loudly. "Hail, Commander, a message from the Tower Watch." I knew this soldier. He often brought me messages from the watch, but usually seemed almost apologetic for interrupting me. There was nothing apologetic in his manner now. "Speak, soldier." "Commander, there's some kind of riot over by the Temple of the Jews. It started with a commotion in the temple's inner courtyards, but now it's moved into the outer courtyards, and it looks like many locals from the city are moving this way. The crowd's growing rapidly. The activity's escalating. We think it's turning violent." Good-natured banter and even occasional ruckus at the temple was common, but my men were experienced enough to know the difference between a lively festival crowd and a violent riot, even observing from nearly a stadia away. The report confirmed everything I was hoping wouldn't be true when the distant noise initially distracted me from my desk work. Did you notify the centurion on duty? The soldier seemed nervous at my question. Concerns from the watch didn't usually come directly to the commander. I had 6 centurions, and one of them was always on duty. The watchtower's normal procedure would be to inform him before I was bothered. A messenger left for him at the same time I came to see you, Commander. The soldier cleared his throat. I was tempted to feel annoyed that the watch had leapfrogged typical protocol and sent me a message directly instead of waiting for the centurion to decide to escalate the scenario. This soldier knew the protocol, yet he was here anyway. That meant this afternoon's watchtower sentries had felt urgently enough to make a judgment call. They'd taken a risk. False alarm or not, I wanted to know when something was making my experienced soldiers nervous. Good, I replied, and saw the immediate flicker of relief in the soldier's expression. I'll head to the colonnade right away. Have my horse meet me there immediately. Yes, Commander, the messenger snapped a salute. Better run, I nodded towards the door. He executed an about-face, broke form, and charged through the open door to the steps. With unthinking movements practiced 1,000 times, I secured my sword in my belt, planted my crested helmet on my head, and then fastened my cape over my right shoulder before I made my way down the stone stairs of the tower. My personal bodyguards, who had been stationed immediately outside my door, stalked my heels as I ducked out of the tower doors and swept into the fortress courtyard. My eyes narrowed in the late afternoon sun. The daytime heat radiated at me from the paving stones and flashed off my breastplate. Squinting, I could see one of my centurions with a detachment of 10 troops already jogging briskly toward the covered colonnade, which connected our fortress to the Jewish temple's outer courtyards. From the growing noise I was hearing and the report of the watch, a dozen men might not be enough. Centurion, I called. He halted his men and jogged over to me. Commander? Take your men and meet me at the colonnade, I spoke urgently. I'll go down with you. I've sent for some cavalry support in case this turns into a riot control mission. Do you think it's a riot? He asked, concern coloring his voice. I'm not sure, I replied, but it's more than the typical rabble. We exchanged salutes and the centurion moved quickly back to his men. The messenger I had spoken to earlier was already across the fortress courtyard by the stable where officers' horses had relief from the heat during daytime duty. I barked at a legionary to find the cavalry centurion and instruct him on my behalf to bring whatever horsemen were saddle ready to come assist me at the temple immediately. I mounted my horse and joined the foot soldiers waiting for me at the colonnade. As we trotted purposefully down toward the temple, I could hear the hooves of several cavalry horses echoing behind me. While I welcomed the extra presence, I hoped the cavalry support would turn out to be unnecessary. I couldn't be precisely sure what to anticipate. From the ambient noise, the ruckus had grown from dozens of men to more than 100. It didn't sound good. The back of my head prickled with battle. A few memories of real battle ghosted through my mind. I shook them off. This isn't battle, I told myself. We hadn't seen actual battle since the uprising of the Egyptian terrorists, but even that had been a grisly cakewalk compared to the actual battles I'd experienced as a younger soldier. Whatever unpleasant situation we were about to face, it was my problem. I was the garrison commander here in Jerusalem. It was my responsibility to assert Roman authority on the local people. Practically speaking, and barring Felix, who was admittedly powerful, but not as powerful as he'd like, there was nobody but me directly between these people and the wrath of the Emperor Claudius. But Claudius reigns in Rome, God's bless him, and I serve here according to his pleasure and his orders. Felix is days away in Caesarea. So here in Jerusalem, whatever brouhaha has ignited down by the Jewish temple, it was my problem. I knew the local Jews baffled my men. Unlike many of my garrison soldiers, several hundred of them depending on the season, I didn't directly dislike the local people, the Jews. Sure, they made my life complicated, and sure, they could seem endlessly problematic as I tried to do my job and maintain the local Roman governing authority. But I was authority, and they didn't like authority. Worse, I was outside authority. The Jews would call me an oppressor, I suppose. Sincerely, rather than trying to make them Romans, I left them as much as I could to their unique traditions, which they took extremely seriously. I suppose I bore these religiously devout Jews a grudging respect. Their sheer stubbornness was admirable. Here I was, representing Rome, the greatest civilization in history, a commander in the most powerful army ever. And the Jews looked at me like I was rudely treading on the toes of their greatness, their heritage, their identity, even their God. They'd been around much longer than we Romans had. The Jews had survived Egyptian oppression, the Amalekite extinction effort, the Philistine invasion, the Moabites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and now I was supposed to keep them in line. The cavalry who had scrambled at my order caught up with our detachment just as we reached the courtyard. The cavalry centurion saluted me, passing the command of himself and the 8 horsemen with him to me. I issued a terse formation command to the cavalry, who quickly arranged themselves to my left and right. I wanted an imposing presence. Yet, as we preferred the conflict didn't turn bloody, I'd rather the horses didn't enter the crowd. I instructed the cavalry to stay wide as a show of force around the perimeter, and the foot soldiers to take point in a tight block. I would wade in behind them on my mount, and we would make our way to whatever or whomever sourced the commotion. At my word, we exited the shade of the colonnade and into the candescent sunlight of the Jews' temple courtyard. We would be an imposing sight. I wasn't expecting violent resistance, but I wanted the roiling crowd to see that authority and order arrived when I did. The sentries at watch had been right. The throng in front of me was in the hundreds and growing fast. Those arriving at the outskirts of the crowd turned to keep wary eyes on us. Being on horseback, I could see over their heads to a knot of furious activity near the center of the mob. It wasn't pretty. With the legionary foot soldiers in front and my 2 bodyguards behind, we advanced swiftly into the crowd. The infantry centurion took point and shouted as we shoved our way forward. "Move aside, make way for the commander." We pushed into the pulsing mass of angry humanity, leveraging every bit of psychological advantage for control. If things got ugly now, lots of people would die, and my men might be among the toll. Men in traditional Jewish robes were crowded around a smaller group of men who I could only describe as receiving a good old-fashioned beatdown, angry mob style. The few unlucky persons were being violently shoved, kicked, and hit by dozens of shouting men pressed around them. Scores more men shouted angry encouragement to those dealing out the beating. I could see from their traditional dress that the most enthusiastic among the punishers were religious elite among the Jews, Pharisees. Religious elite or not, I wasn't about to allow a standard of mob justice to replace Roman law in this city. I urged my soldiers forward until we were pushing right into the royally midst of the melee. The shouting was in Aramaic and a sprinkle of Hebrew, but I knew the most educated would speak Greek. I possessed a few useful phrases in Hebrew. I alternated shouting "Zemespik" and "Arketa," or "That's enough," in Aramaic and Greek, until the most energetic chastisers turned their attention from punishing their victims to me. Having briefly quelled their bloodlust, I called to the ranking Pharisees, "What's going on?" Not all of them understood my Greek, and many of those who did understand would refuse on principle to actually speak Greek. Some responded in shouts, "Criminals, rebels, terrorists," in so many words, and it was repeated in various local languages so that the whole uproar started again. Terrorists. One of the men receiving the beating must be the Egyptian terrorists who had led the assassins' revolt a year ago. Who else could cause such an uproar? If it was the terrorist, he was a fool. I'd personally led the bloody response to their scourge of assassinations. My men and I had cut down hundreds of them as they fled outside the city and into the desert. The leader had vanished, and now it seems he had returned. The situation would escalate if I didn't control it. "Arrest those men," I instructed my centurion. He and the infantry soldiers hauled the 3 bedraggled criminals to their feet. "Not those 2, him!" A sweating, red-faced Pharisee with the largest religious phylacteries I'd ever seen bound to his forehead shouted at me and gestured furiously. He indicated one prisoner in particular, who I assumed to be the terrorist. Wanting to pacify their anger, I ordered the one man he indicated to be separated from the others and shackled hand and foot. The newly bound, pummeled man swayed perilously on his feet. "Who are the other two?" I asked the Pharisee. "We don't care. Take the others if you want, but that one needs to die. Rid the earth of him." He shouted it more to the crowd than to me. The crowd roared in approval. The Pharisees seemed not to want to lose their prize. Knowing the crowd was on their side and sensing bloodlust in the air, they renewed shouting, calling for an immediate execution. We technically had 3 prisoners. It seemed the religious venom was directed at one in particular. They surged forward and the crowd crushed behind them. "Who is he? What has he done?" I yelled above the din at the leaders. A confusion was shouted back at me. I heard infidel, terrorist, heretic, murderer, traitor, conspirator, and uglier synonyms as men in the crowd screamed accusations. Somebody threw a stone and it struck one of the other two prisoners on his shoulder, causing him to stagger. My soldier reacted quickly, shoving the thrower back hard. The situation was getting out of hand, as long as the object of their wrath remained under their control. "Get the prisoners out of here! Back to the barracks!" I roared to my men, pointing with my arm so they knew the direction. My foot soldiers lowered their shoulders and propelled through the crowd, dragging the 3 prisoners between them. A howling multitude surged with us. Focusing on the prized prisoner especially, they grabbed at him and tried to tear him from the grasp of my men who escorted him. They're going to tear him apart, I thought. Realizing this might not be far from the truth, my thought became vocal. "They're going to tear him apart!" I hollered to my men, redoubling their urgency. My horse wasn't loving the commotion, but he was a seasoned warhorse and behaving as well as could be expected. He'd been through worse. I pushed my steed up alongside the main prisoner, reached down, and hauled the prisoner up and threw him across my saddle, practically in my lap. He seemed barely conscious. Following my lead, the legionaries on foot bodily lifted the other 2 prisoners onto their shoulders and marched through the chaos towards our barracks steps. The mounted cavalry reinforcements we had left at the outskirts of the crowd perceived the escalation and moved to make an avenue for us to exit the mob. The steps from the courtyard up towards our fortress were like a physical barrier. The Jews, angry as they were, hesitated to follow us into Gentile territory, and of course they couldn't enter the fortress at the top of the steps. It was a relief to see my soldiers resume formation around me as we left the agitated crowd behind and made our way up the wide steps towards the barracks. Just as we'd put the worst of it behind us, the man, crumpled across my saddle like a sack of grain, lifted his head, twisted, and thoughtfully considered me. I hadn't even had a proper look at him. He didn't look like an Egyptian terrorist. He was small, unassuming, mostly bald. His eyes were bright, but I had a sense he was having trouble focusing on me. Probably been hit in the head during the thrashing he'd endured. I could see bruises and swelling forming on his face. Unexpectedly, he didn't appear defeated. He seemed intense. His battered face fought a grin. What kind of man comes out of this ordeal in a good mood, I thought. Then he surprised me further. "May I say something to you?" he asked through a split and bleeding lip in perfect, unaccented Greek. I was so taken aback, all I could respond was, "Do you know Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian terrorist we chased into the wilderness?" Implausibly, he chuckled. "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia." From his upside-down vantage point, he looked back at the angry mass of human hatred behind us. He peered up to me. "A citizen of no small city," he emphasized solemnly, seeming to sense the irony of his entirely ridiculous posture. I'd have thought he was crazy if he didn't seem so present. We were more than halfway up the steps toward the fortress. The man looked urgently back to me. "Let me speak to the people, please, I beg you." I hated begging, but he wasn't really begging. He was acknowledging his undignified position, making me see myself like him. He wasn't a madman, he was a prisoner. But against all of my better judgment, and with an unusual level of curiosity, I reined in my horse. Gripping the man's arm, I slid him down from the saddle, his tunic bunching up against his thighs as he descended. My soldiers looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. Let him speak. I gestured to the milling crowd down at the bottom of the steps. Perhaps we'll figure out what is going on. It may save us an interrogation. The infantry and cavalry centurions shrugged at each other. The remaining horses made their way to the landing above us. The unassuming man by my horse moved up a couple of steps. He took a deep breath, and to my surprise, suddenly seemed like an experienced orator. He held out his hands to the chaos below. I was astonished how quickly the mob became quiet, a quiet, waiting audience. They looked towards him as though they had all shown up for this very moment. My men and I exchanged puzzled glances. Awkwardly, I moved my horse up a few more steps to join the cavalry on the landing. My mount's hooves rang in the sudden silence. In my head, I rationalized that this allowance was the best way to get to the bottom of the situation. I hated being the least informed. The city is in an uproar. I misidentified the culprit as an Egyptian terrorist, and I had nothing useful to report if asked inevitably. Let's hear the man out, I proposed. What more trouble can he possibly cause at this point? Once again, I'd underestimated my prisoner. In a somewhat nasal voice, he started speaking in Hebrew. My soldiers and I cast annoyed glances at each other. Based on my exchange with him, I thought the prisoner was a Jew from a Greek territory, but then he pulls this stunt, changing languages so I can barely follow, while the Jewish leaders in the crowd below eat up his words. My Hebrew was broken at best. I grasped fragments of his speech, but all I could really gather was that he was telling a story about meeting a powerful man while on a long journey. His voice had opened up now. It boomed across the courtyard. The crowd was entranced. I was antsy. How long would this story be? Would I have to step in? After some minutes, the story seemed to be taking a turn, much to my relief. Wind it down, I thought, let's go get some answers. At least he'd calmed the crowd. Bodingly, I heard him say something about Gentiles. Then, like an explosion, the crowd erupted, presumably in response to whatever he had said. It wasn't a happy response. If anything, their former fury redoubled. They began to surge up the steps. Some of them threw off their cloaks and heaved dust into the air, a distinctly Jewish demonstration of righteous outrage. I had no specific idea what he'd said, but I was in motion immediately. Go, I shouted. We scooped up our prisoners, me hauling the mystifying little man back up into my lap by the scruff of his tunic. My soldiers and I charged with our prisoners and to the safety offered by our Roman fortress. The sentries at the gates had witnessed much of the unfolding drama. They let us in and quickly bolted the gates behind me. I glowered around the courtyard in exasperation. What did you say to them? I shouted at the prisoner. He peered dumbly at me. Really? I scoffed at him in annoyance. A rabble-rousing, public-speaking polyglot with nothing to say now that I have a question. What crime did you commit to make the entire city call for your blood? No response. Anger roused, I barked at the infantrymen still restraining the other prisoners. Interrogation. By flogging. Now. Get answers. We dragged the prisoners over to my least favorite section of the barracks, the interrogation chamber at the prison quarters. I hated interrogations. They always made me so angry. Angry at everything and everyone. Angry that I once again had to wallow in the ugliest aspects of humanity like a pig enjoying mud. Would my life ever be free of brutality, blood, and bludgeons? My mother wanted me to be a scholar. God's rest her soul, and thank Olympus, she hadn't really known what the day-to-day of my prestigious military job often entailed. The prison warden, who was also the chief interrogator, began setting up the interrogation. He roughly stripped the primary prisoner's clothes off his back. I was startled to see the man's back was covered in scars. He'd been flogged before, multiple times, as testified by the newer scars lacing across the older. The prison warden raised his eyebrows at me. As I remained obdurate, the warden compliantly resumed, tying the prisoner's hands above his head, stretching him out for yet another beating. The man's companions and the other two prisoners looked pale. The other two prisoners looked pale. Their eyes bulged and their lips moved in words I couldn't hear, probably plying appeals to their gods and presumably unscarred flesh on their backs. I didn't need to be here for this. I stormed out of the building, intending to head back to my tower quarters, where I knew I had a flagon of wine waiting for me. I would quaff it like a thirsty man at water after a long march. I strode across the courtyard, expecting any second to hear the thwack of heavy whips, which would inevitably be complemented by desperate shrieks. Gods above and below, I hated interrogations, hated all of this. Rather than lashes lacerating skin, I heard a stern voice call, "Commander!" I turned to see my centurion jogging from the prison towards me. "What now, centurion?" My voice carried venom he hadn't earned. The centurion balked. "Commander, we can't interrogate the man." "By Hades, what now?" I spit. "He's a Roman citizen." Roman citizen. It rang in my ears. No Roman citizen could be flogged without a proper trial and conviction, and no fool would claim Roman citizenship falsely. The punishment for lying about citizenship was immediate death. My own citizenship had been granted by the Emperor Claudius himself, at tremendous financial expense and a life of service on my part, and I'd still taken Claudius's name and thanks. He's a Roman citizen. With the understanding, my anger dissolved, and I let out a low chuckle. The prisoner had beaten me at my own game. Every time I thought I was in control, he played a better hand. I stalked back to the interrogation chamber. The little man, still stretched out for the whips, stared right at me. I could have sworn I saw a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, but he had the brains to remain utterly respectful. "Tell me," I spoke with a measure of patience my real feelings didn't quite match. "Are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes," a simple answer. I rolled my eyes. "That little fact could have come up sooner, no?" No response from him. No apology, no excuses, no gloating. I pitied any who made the mistake of debating this man publicly. I was starting to understand why the Jews might want him dead. How did a little Jewish man like this, apparently loathed by all authority, gain Roman citizenship? "I bought my own citizenship at a great price." I spoke meaningfully and looked intently at him. He met my eyes and responded, "But I was a citizen at birth." He said it quietly, not a boast, a fact. Who was this man? The prison warden took a step back. He looked at the whip in his hand, quickly set it down, and made a quiet exit. I personally untied the prisoner's hands and helped him stand. It was the least I could do, as he had the right to make me look especially bad if he took this to the courts. "Care for the prisoners," I ordered the centurion. "Keep them under guard, but fed, bandaged, and bathed." "Thank you, Commander," the prison said genuinely. Relief swept the room. "Centurion," I called as the group turned toward the exits. My centurion snapped his head around to look at me. Thanks. I owed him. Had that whip landed even a single illegal blow, it might as well have been me on the rack after the courts were through with me. My centurion nodded in acknowledgement. The room cleared. Walking back towards my chamber, I realized I had more facts, but no fewer questions. Quite the contrary. Yet I would sleep well. In the morning, we would have a proper, civilized discussion with the Jewish council and get to the bottom of this little mystery.